So if you're a Kiss fan and you live in the Northeast, come out for all 5 shows of what we're calling Kiss Stock.
Oh, hell, the Northeast! Oh, it's times like this I curse the fact that we live in French Polynesia.
No, Peter, we're in the Northeast.
We are? And Kiss is coming to the Northeast. That means...
That means...
No, Lois, don't help me. It means we can do something.
Come on, Peter, you're almost there.
We can go to Kiss Stock!
Ah!
Okay, let's talk a little bit about arguments. We're in the logic section of the course right now, and arguments play a big role, of course, in logic, but in philosophy generally. We're going to be looking at arguments all semester long and learning how to evaluate them is what we're going to focus on in this section of the class. But first, just want to introduce this idea of an argument to us. It's a term everybody's, of course, probably familiar with. You've probably had an argument maybe recently with someone or maybe yourself. But of course, we have a more technical definition that we're going to be working with in class, and it's important to understand that as a background information here. So you're going to be reading articles about arguments, and I want to make sure that everybody has their head wrapped around this basic idea. So I often play this clip or post this clip. You can find it online easily on YouTube from Monty Python's Argument Clinic. And in that video, they introduce a couple of key ideas. One of them is a contradiction. We're going to be looking at that in this section of the course as well. But they give us the technical definition of an argument that's used in logic and in philosophy, and that we're going to be working with in this class. So, of course, most people, when they think of an argument, they think of just a disagreement or a dispute between two or more parties. And of course, that's a common way of thinking about an argument. That's kind of what the common term often means in common usage. But what we're worried about is something a bit more specific than that. So more of a precising definition of an argument than a lexical definition of an argument that we're going to be working with here. So by an argument, what we mean is not simply a disagreement or debate between two people, but a group of propositions or statements such that at least the truth of at least one of those statements is said to imply the truth of another of those statements. The premise is said to imply the truth of the conclusion in an argument, right? And so that's a more precise or technical definition of an argument. It's a group of propositions that try to prove something. And you've just watched this clip from Family Guy about Kiss Stock, where Peter reasons through whether or not he can go to Kiss Stock based on what he believes to be the case about where he lives. So the dialogue in the first part of the argument there, Peter's, and the joke is that he's confused about where he lives, so he thinks he can't go to Kiss Stock. And then Lois corrects him, and then he has a corrected argument that leads him to the correct conclusion that he can attend Kiss Stock. So I've just reformulated those everyday conversational chains of reasoning into proper form or formal arguments that we'll be learning, like the ones we're going to be learning about here coming up in the class. And so let's take a look at that. So first, he reasons incorrectly that if we do not live in the north, if we don't live in the Northwest, then we can't go to Kiss Stock, which that's a true statement. The second premise of his argument is that he lives in French Polynesia, so he does not live in the Northeast. Thus, he cannot go to Kiss Stock. And of course, in his incorrect reasoning, the incorrect part is about where he lives. It's that second line there. We've got two premises, and then the third line is the conclusion. And his second premise is false. Lois corrects him. So we get a different argument in the second part of the dialogue. If we live in the Northeast, then we can go to Kiss Stock. Again, a true statement. They live in the Northeast, so he's got his correct premise in there. Thus, he figures out that he can go to Kiss Stock. He makes the inference that he can go to Kiss Stock, right? So again, arguments, what we have in mind and the way we're going to be thinking about arguments is not in that broad sense of the term or that common usage of the term as a debate between two people. We're certainly going to look at debates between different philosophical positions. So, I mean, that's a relevant idea of an argument that's still relevant for us. But we're going to be talking more about the sorts of arguments that each of those parties would be giving each other, right? And so that's a group of statements or propositions, again, in which the truth of at least one of those propositions, the premise or premises, there's usually more than one, but there has to be one, is said to support or imply the truth of another proposition, the conclusion. And ultimately, there'll only be one final conclusion to an argument. Sometimes you can have very complex arguments where there are different stages in them, and you have sub-conclusions that then form new premises in the argument that lead to a further conclusion, but ultimately they'll just have one conclusion. So I've got a proper or standard form example of an argument here. It's a pretty classic example where we've got here I'll just label them here. We've got the first premise here is line 1. We've got another premise here with line 2, and then the conclusion here, right? So again, this is an example that has 2 premises. An argument has to have at least one, right? And so we've got 2 basic parts there, the premises, and then there's another part of an argument that I used to like to kind of specify that's the link or the alleged link between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion there. So we got all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, thus Socrates is mortal. It's a kind of classic example of an argument in syllogistic logic. And so again, the idea that we're working with here of an argument, it's got 3 main parts. We've got the premise, and again, there will be at least one premise. There's usually more than one. And then we have the conclusion, right? That's the final line of the argument, the point that the arguer is trying to prove. And then there's the alleged link between the truth of the premises and the conclusion, and that's the inference. So I say alleged because arguments can fail, right? So when you might have an argument, it could be a bad argument or a good argument. One of the things we're going to be worried about in this section is how to tell the difference between good arguments and bad arguments, logically speaking, not just rhetorically in the rhetorically persuasive sense. We want logically or rationally persuasive arguments, not merely rhetorically persuasive arguments. So again, an argument is a particular part of our discourse, right? Again, it's a group of statements that try to prove something. The arguments usually will have a factual claim and an inferential claim. So again, inferences is the basic idea of an argument. Is at the heart of it is the idea of an inference, the alleged connection between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusions. And then you've got all sorts of non-arguments, right? Statements of belief or opinion, right? Loosely associated statements, warnings, single conditional statements by themselves are not arguments, but they might be parts of arguments. And then the last 3 I list here, expository passages, explanations, and illustrations, I have asterisks by them because depending on the context, they might count as arguments, again, depending on the context. You might have, like in an explanation, an abductive argument there could be involved in an explanation, although it might not be an argument. Again, it depends on the content and context, or an illustration where we have argument by example. So again, the last 3 here, kind of the special cases, you got to worry about the context and the content of those in order to distinguish whether they are arguments or non-arguments. And then there are 2 basic types of arguments. We've got deductive arguments and inductive arguments. We have arguments that have an alleged, again, it could fail, so it's just alleged, a really robust link between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. In a deductive argument, the truth of the conclusion is said to follow necessarily from the truth of the premises. And in an inductive argument, it's just a matter of probability. You could have higher or lower probability, so those are going to be strong or weak arguments, whereas in deductive arguments, we call them valid or invalid, and it either is valid or it's an invalid argument. There's not a matter of degree there like there is with probability. And so again, we've got the classic example of a deductive argument. All human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, so Socrates is mortal. And then on the other side, the right-hand side, we've got the inductive argument. We randomly surveyed 20% of the incoming freshman class and found that most of them are big football fans. Thus, it's likely that most of the incoming freshman class are big football fans. Again, the difference between those two types of arguments is deductive necessity versus inductive probability.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about evaluating arguments. What makes for a good argument, logically speaking? We've got our idea of an argument down. We talked about two basic types of argument, deductive and inductive. And then, of course, we need to know how to evaluate these arguments. So we've got two questions to ask when we're evaluating an argument. A, are the premises all true? And B, if the premises are all true, do they logically imply the truth of the conclusion, either with deductive validity or inductive strength? Right? So we've got these two evaluation questions. We might have a false premise due to an empirical error. We could have a false premise due to a logical contradiction. So we'd have a logical falsehood in that case. You could also end up with a self-contradiction and a conclusion, or between two different lines of a premise of an argument. But if we got a single line in the argument that results in a self-contradictory statement, then we've got a logical falsehood there. So again, if all the premises need to be true in the argument, if we have one or more false premises, either due to a logical falsehood or an empirical falsehood, a scientific error, then the argument fails. And then the second question, does the truth of the premises imply, logically speaking, the truth of the conclusion? If the answer to both questions is yes, then the argument proves its conclusion. Okay, so if both questions are answered affirmatively, all the premises are true, and the conclusion is either has either deductive necessity or probabilistic strength, then the argument's a good argument, logically speaking. If the answer to either question, one or the other, is no, then the argument fails. So an argument with a false premise can't support the truth of its conclusion, and an argument with a fallacy where the conclusion could still either be false with inductive weakness or deductive invalidity, then the argument fails as well. That means the truth of the premises, even if true, don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion. So we'd have a fallacy there. So you got to make sure that you're kind of distinguishing different types of errors that might occur in an argument. A false premise is one kind of error, two different ways that might occur, or a fallacy where the premises do not imply, either with deductive validity or inductive strength, the truth of the conclusion. So again, we know we got two different types of arguments: deductive or inductive reasoning, necessity versus probabilistic arguments. And what we're looking for are deductive arguments that are valid, meaning they have a valid form, and have all true premises, meaning that they're sound. So soundness here always presupposes validity. So if we got to a sound deductive argument, then the argument proves its conclusion. If we get an inductive argument, a probabilistic argument, we're looking for that argument to be strong rather than weak, and to have all true premises, meaning it's cogent. So again, that argument would prove its conclusion. We end up in trouble when either one of our two questions gets a negative answer. If the argument contains a fallacy, then it's either deductively flawed, right, and an invalid, a formal fallacy. If it is a weak inductive argument, then that's also equivalent to a fallacy, meaning that the conclusion is more likely to be false, even if the premises are true. And so what we're always looking for, again, are inductively cogent arguments and deductively sound arguments. So there's a little bit about the basic vocabulary and criteria for evaluating arguments. We'll be using those basic ideas all semester long.